Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Tommy Martinez thought he knew every mile of Highway 83 through Nebraska, like the back of his weathered hands. In 18 years of hauling grain from Omaha to Denver, the 42-year-old had driven this stretch more times than he could count. The two-lane highway cut through endless fields of corn and wheat, past farmhouses that dotted the landscape like scattered seeds. It was peaceful country, the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their porches, and the biggest excitement was usually a high school football game on Friday nights. But on the night of September 15th, 2019, Tommy would discover that even the most familiar roads can become completely foreign, completely wrong, in ways that challenge everything you think you know about the world. The evening started normally enough. Tommy had loaded up at the Heartland grain terminal just outside Omaha, his rig heavy with premium corn bound for a processing plant in Colorado. His wife, Sarah, had packed him his usual thermos of coffee and a sandwich, kissing him goodbye at 5:30 like she had thousands of times before. Their youngest daughter, Emma, just turned 16, had reminded him to drive safe. "Always do, sweetheart," he'd told her, meaning every word. Tommy was religious about safety. In 18 years, he'd never had so much as a fender bender. He knew his equipment inside and out, checked his logs meticulously, and never pushed when he was tired. His company, Nebraska Freight Lines, considered him their most reliable driver. When other truckers called in sick or had equipment problems, Tommy was the one they called to fill in. The drive to Denver usually took about 8 hours, including mandatory rest stops. Tommy preferred the night run because traffic was lighter and the temperatures were cooler for the grain. He'd done this route so many times he could practically drive it in his sleep, though, of course, he never would. Safety first, always. By 9:15 that evening, Tommy was making good time through the rolling hills west of Lincoln. The weather was perfect, clear skies with a 3/4 moon casting silver light across the prairie. His CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, the usual mix of weather updates, traffic reports, and friendly conversation that kept long-haul truckers connected across the lonely highways. "Eastbound grain hauler approaching mile marker 47, came a voice over Channel 19. "How's it looking ahead, westbound?" Tommy picked up his microphone. "Westbound grain truck here, about 5 miles ahead of you. Road's clear, smooth sailing. Watch for a deer about 2 miles back. Saw one thinking about crossing. Much obliged, westbound. Drive safe out there." "You too, partner." It was exactly the kind of routine exchange that happened hundreds of times every night on highways across America. Professional drivers looking out for each other, sharing information that might prevent accidents or delays. Nothing unusual, nothing that would stick in anyone's memory. At 9:47, Tommy's headlights picked up the familiar green sign for Millbrook, population 812. He'd passed through this tiny farming community countless times. There was a gas station that stayed open until 10, a small diner that served the best apple pie in 3 counties, and a hardware store that had been run by the same family for 4 generations. Tommy knew Millbrook the way he knew his own neighborhood back in Omaha. But as his truck rolled into the town limits, something felt wrong. The gas station was there, but its sign was different. Instead of the familiar Shell logo, it displayed the name Morrison's Fuel in faded red letters. The building looked older somehow, with wooden siding instead of the modern metal construction Tommy remembered. Even stranger, the diner was gone entirely, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. Tommy slowed his rig, confusion creeping up his spine like cold fingers. Maybe he was more tired than he'd thought. Maybe he was mixing up Millbrook with some other small town. But no, there was the water tower with Millbrook Wildcats painted on the side. There was the grain elevator. There was the Methodist church with its distinctive white steeple. But everything else was wrong. The houses looked different, older. Paint was peeling, and some buildings appeared to be abandoned. Streetlights cast weak yellow pools of illumination instead of the bright white LED fixtures that had been installed 2 years ago. Most unsettling of all, there were no cars parked along the street. No lights in any of the windows. No signs of life anywhere. Tommy pulled his truck to a stop in front of where the diner should have been. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his CB radio. Any drivers in the Millbrook area come back? His voice sounded strange to his own ears, tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Static answered him. "This is westbound grain truck in Millbrook, looking for a radio check. Anyone out there?" More static. Tommy tried his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't entirely unusual in rural Nebraska, but the display showed something impossible. Instead of "no service," it read "network not found," as if cellular networks had never been invented. He stepped down from his cab into the cool night air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the idle of his diesel engine. No night sounds, no crickets, no distant hum of air conditioners or television sets. Just silence, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Walking toward what should have been the diner, Tommy noticed more disturbing details. The pavement under his feet was cracked and weathered, with weeds growing through the gaps. Rust stains streaked down the sides of buildings. Everything looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Yet the basic layout of the town remained exactly as he remembered it. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a lonely sound that made Tommy's skin crawl. He hurried back to his truck, suddenly eager to leave this wrong version of Millbrook behind. But as he climbed back into the cab, his headlights swept across something that made his blood run cold. The street sign at the corner read Main Street, just as it always had. But underneath, in smaller letters, it said Millbrook Township, established 1887, abandoned 1952, abandoned in 1952. But Tommy had driven through Millbrook just 3 weeks ago, had stopped at the Shell station for coffee and conversation with the owner, had waved to kids playing in the park. His hands trembling, Tommy put the truck in gear and accelerated out of the town. In his side mirror, he watched the streetlights of Millbrook disappear behind him, but they seemed to fade too quickly, as if the town itself was dissolving back into the darkness. For the next 20 miles, Tommy drove in a state of numb shock. He kept the radio on, hoping to hear another driver, anyone who could confirm that he wasn't losing his mind. But the airwaves remained silent, filled only with the hiss of static. At 11:15, he reached the junction with Interstate 80, where Highway 83 connected to the main east-west route through Nebraska. This was always a busy intersection, with trucks and cars merging from multiple directions. But tonight, the interstate was empty. Not just light traffic, but completely empty, as if every other vehicle in the world had simply vanished. Tommy pulled into the rest area at the junction, his mind reeling. The facilities were there, the restrooms and picnic tables and vending machines, but they all looked old and weathered. Rust stained the metal, and several windows were broken. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the parking lot, but the most disturbing sight was the information board near the restrooms. It displayed a map of Nebraska with highways and towns marked in the usual way, but Millbrook wasn't on it. According to this official state map, There was no town at all where Millbrook should have been. Just empty prairie. Tommy stared at the map for a long time, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He'd been driving through Nebraska for 18 years. He knew where every town was, had delivered grain to most of them at one time or another. Millbrook was real. He had friends there, had attended the annual corn festival, had eaten countless meals at the diner. But according to this map, none of that had ever existed. A sound behind him made Tommy spin around. An elderly man in coveralls was walking toward him from the direction of the restrooms. The man looked to be in his 70s, with thin white hair and deeply lined face that spoke of a lifetime working outdoors. "Evening," the old man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Tommy couldn't place. "Having truck trouble?" "No, sir," Tommy replied, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Just trying to figure out where I am." The old man chuckled. "Well, that's easy enough. You're at the junction of Highway 83 and Interstate 80, about 40 miles west of Lincoln. Not much else around here, just farmland and prairie." "What about Millbrook?" Tommy asked. "The town about 20 miles back east." The old man's expression changed, becoming puzzled and slightly concerned. "Son, there's no town called Millbrook along Highway 83. I've lived in these parts for 73 years, and I know every settlement within 100 miles. You sure you got the name right?" Tommy felt the world tilting around him. I've driven through it dozens of times. There's a gas station, a diner, a grain elevator. Nearest town east of here is Greenwood, about 35 miles back. You might be thinking of that." The old man studied Tommy's face in the dim light. "You feeling all right, son? Look a little pale." "I'm fine," Tommy lied. "Just tired, I guess. Long day." The old man nodded sympathetically. "Road can play tricks on a fellow when he's been driving too long. Get yourself some rest when you can." As the man walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the rest area lights, Tommy stood alone with his confusion and growing fear. He pulled out his logbook and checked his entries. According to his own handwriting, he'd left Omaha at 6:30 and driven straight through to this rest stop with no recorded stops, but he clearly remembered passing through Millbrook less than 2 hours ago. Back in his truck, Tommy tried the radio again. This time, he got an answer. "This is eastbound cattle hauler on I-80, about 50 miles east of you," came a gravelly voice. "What's your 20 grain truck?" "I'm at the rest area at the 83 junction," Tommy replied, relief flooding through him at the sound of another human voice. "Listen, this might sound crazy, but have you ever heard of a town called Millbrook along Highway 83? A pause. "Millbrook. No, can't say that I have." "You sure you got the name right?" I thought I did." "Well, I've been running this route for 15 years, and I know every truck stop and town between here and Denver. Closest thing to what you're describing would be Greenwood, but that's nowhere near 83 inches. Tommy thanked the other driver and signed off, but the conversation only deepened his confusion. He'd known about Millbrook since he started driving this route. He had clear memories of stopping there, of conversations with local people, of business transactions at the gas station. But apparently, none of that had ever happened. Tommy spent the rest of the night driving toward Denver in a fog of bewilderment. Every mile marker, every exit sign, every landmark along the way was exactly where it should be. Nothing else seemed wrong or out of place. It was only Millbrook that had become impossible, that had apparently never existed at all. When he arrived at the grain processing plant in Denver the next morning, Tommy was exhausted and shaken. The delivery went smoothly, with no problems or delays. His paperwork was all in order. His cargo was exactly what had been ordered. and the plant supervisor signed off on the delivery without any questions. But when Tommy called dispatch to report his arrival, the conversation took yet another disturbing turn. "Good timing, Tommy," said Janet, the dispatcher. He'd worked with for over a decade. "How was the drive? Any problems with construction on 83? "Construction?" Tommy asked. "I didn't see any construction." "Really? The state DOT told us there'd be delays near Millbrook for that bridge replacement project. They estimated it might add an hour to the drive time." Tommy's mouth went dry. "Janet, what did you say about Millbrook?" "The bridge replacement project. They're rebuilding the overpass where 83 crosses Miller Creek. Should be finished next month." "But Janet..." Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. "There is no Millbrook." A long pause. "Tommy, are you feeling okay? Of course there's a Millbrook. You've stopped there for gas dozens of times. What's wrong?" Tommy couldn't answer. He couldn't explain that he'd driven through a version of Millbrook that was abandoned and wrong, or that he'd met an old man who insisted the town had never existed, or that official maps showed nothing but empty prairie where the town should be. Over the following weeks, Tommy's confusion only deepened. Some people, like Janet the dispatcher, insisted that Millbrook was real, and that Tommy had visited it many times. Others, including several veteran drivers who knew Highway 83 well, claimed they'd never heard of any such town. Tommy began keeping detailed notes of his conversations, trying to find some pattern that might explain the discrepancy. What he discovered was even more unsettling than the original incident. Whether someone knew about Millbrook seemed to depend on when and where Tommy talked to them. People at his home base in Omaha generally knew about the town. People he met on the road, especially in Nebraska, generally didn't. It was as if there were two different versions of reality, and Tommy was somehow caught between them. The final piece of the puzzle came 3 months later, when Tommy was researching Nebraska history at the Omaha Public Library. In a dusty volume of county records from the 1950s, he found a brief entry that made his blood run cold. Millbrook Township, established 1887, was permanently evacuated in October 1952, following contamination from an experimental agricultural chemical spill. All residents were relocated, and the town site was declared uninhabitable. Structures were demolished in 1953, and the area was returned to agricultural use. Below this entry was a black and white photograph showing the evacuation. Families loaded their belongings into trucks and cars, while men in hazmat suits supervised the operation. In the background, Tommy could clearly see the Shell gas station, the diner, the Methodist church, all exactly as he remembered them. But according to every map, every GPS system, and half the people he talked to, the town had never existed at all. Tommy still drives Highway 83, but he no longer stops in Millbrook. Sometimes, late at night when the moon is 3/4 full, he thinks he sees lights in the distance where the town should be. But he drives past without slowing down, because he's learned that some roads lead to places that exist in the spaces between what was and what is, and a smart driver knows better than to stop in towns that were abandoned 70 years ago, but somehow still remember when truckers used to visit for coffee and conversation. The Nebraska Department of Transportation has no record of any construction project in the Millbrook area. There are no plans for bridge replacement on Miller Creek, because according to their maps, Miller Creek doesn't exist either. But Janet the dispatcher still asks Tommy about construction delays near Millbrook, and the GPS in his truck still shows a gas station where he can stop for fuel, and sometimes late at night when he's fighting sleep. Tommy wonders if he's the one who doesn't exist, if he's become a ghost driver hauling ghost cargo through a world that can't decide whether the places he remembers were ever real at all. The first thing Sarah Chen noticed about the man standing beside the broken-down sedan was that he didn't look like he belonged. It was 2:30 in the morning at the Pine Ridge truck stop, a lonely outpost along Interstate 84 in eastern Oregon. And most people you'd see at that hour were truckers grabbing coffee or a quick meal before hitting the road again. This guy was different. Too clean, too well-dressed, and way too calm for someone whose car had apparently died in the middle of nowhere. Sarah had been driving long haul for 7 years, ever since her divorce, when she needed a way to support herself and her daughter Jessica without being tied to one place. At 34, she'd earned a reputation as one of the most reliable drivers at Western Freight Solutions. She was careful, methodical, and possessed the kind of situational awareness that kept her safe on roads where women truckers sometimes faced dangers their male colleagues never had to consider. But tonight, as she walked across the dimly lit parking lot toward the truck stop diner, something about the well-dressed stranger made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. The man appeared to be in his 40s, wearing slacks and a button-down shirt that looked expensive even under the harsh fluorescent lights. His car, a dark blue sedan, sat with its hood up in one of the parking spaces designated for regular vehicles. Steam rose from the engine compartment, suggesting an overheated radiator or blown hose. Standard car trouble, the kind that happened to travelers every day. What bothered Sarah was the man's demeanor. Instead of looking frustrated or worried like most stranded motorists, he seemed almost expectant. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the comings and goings of truckers with the patient attention of someone waiting for exactly the right opportunity. As Sarah passed within 30 feet of the broken-down car, the man looked directly at her and smiled. "Excuse me, miss," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet parking lot. "I hate to bother you, but I'm in a bit of a jam here." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Rule number 1 for any trucker, but especially for women: be helpful when you can, but never compromise your safety. She stopped walking but didn't approach the car. "What kind of trouble?" she called back, keeping her distance. "Radiator hose burst about 10 miles back," the man explained, still smiling. "Got her this far before she overheated completely. Thing is, the parts store doesn't open until 8, and I've got a really important meeting in Portland this morning. My daughter's wedding, actually." He gestured toward the car with what appeared to be genuine frustration. "I was wondering if you might be heading west? I'd be happy to pay for gas. Even throw in a couple $100 for your trouble. I just really need to get to Portland." It was a reasonable request, the kind of thing that happened regularly in the trucking world. Drivers helping stranded motorists, offering rides to the next town or a phone to call for help. Sarah had both given and received such assistance over the years. It was part of the unspoken code of the road. But something felt wrong about this particular situation. Maybe it was the way the man's smile never quite reached his eyes. Maybe it was how he'd been standing there so patiently, as if he'd been waiting for exactly the right person to ask. Or maybe it was the simple fact that his story, while plausible, felt rehearsed. "Sorry," Sarah said, backing toward the diner. "Company policy doesn't allow riders. Insurance issues." The man's smile faltered slightly. "I understand. It's just, this is really important to me. My daughter." He let his voice trail off, as if overcome with emotion. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy, but her instincts were screaming at her to get away from this situation. "There's a payphone inside the diner. You can call a cab or a tow truck." "Already tried," the man said, taking a step toward her. "No one's available until morning. Look, I know this is irregular, but I'm pretty desperate here. I'd really appreciate the help." That's when Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The man's shoes were expensive dress shoes, polished and pristine, but the soles were completely clean, without a trace of dust or dirt. If he'd really walked 10 miles from where his car broke down, or even if he'd just been standing in this gravel parking lot for any length of time, his shoes should have shown some evidence of it. "I'm sorry," Sarah said firmly, continuing toward the diner. "I can't help you." The man watched her go, his smile disappearing entirely. "That's too bad," he called after her. "I was really hoping we could work something out." Something in his tone made Sarah look back. The man was no longer standing by his car. He was walking purposefully toward a white panel van parked at the far edge of the lot, a vehicle she hadn't noticed before. As she watched, he pulled out what appeared to be a cell phone and made a brief call. Sarah's discomfort escalated to genuine alarm. She hurried into the diner, where the familiar warmth and light provided some comfort. The night waitress, a friendly woman named Dolores who'd been working the Pine Ridge stop for 15 years, greeted her with a smile. "Hey, honey, you're out late tonight. Coffee?" "Please," Sarah said, sliding into a booth where she could see the parking lot through the window. "Dolores, you notice anything strange about that guy with the broken-down sedan?" Dolores followed her gaze toward the parking lot. "What sedan, honey?" Sarah looked again. The blue car was gone. In its place was an empty parking space, as if the vehicle had never been there at all. "There was a guy out there just a minute ago," Sarah said, confusion replacing her fear. "Car trouble, asking for a ride to Portland. Must have got it fixed," Dolores said, but she was looking at Sarah with concern. "You okay? You look a little shaken up." Before Sarah could answer, another trucker entered the diner. Bill Morrison was a veteran driver she'd known for years, a reliable guy who ran regular routes between California and Washington. "Evening, Sarah," Bill said, nodding as he took a seat at the counter. "Quiet night out there. Bill, did you see a guy with a broken-down car when you came in?" Sarah asked. Bill shook his head. "Nope. Just the usual trucks." "Why?" Sarah was about to explain when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her dispatcher's number, which was unusual at this hour. "Sarah, this is Mike at dispatch. We just got a strange call about you." "What kind of call?" "Guy claimed to be Oregon State Police. Said there was some kind of incident at Pine Ridge involving one of our drivers. Wanted your truck number and your planned route. Thing is, when I called the state police to verify, they said they never made any such call." Sarah's mouth went dry. "Mike, I think someone just tried to... I don't know what they tried to do. But something's not right here. Where are you now?" "Inside the diner at Pine Ridge. Mike, there was a guy out there asking for a ride. Said his car broke down, but when I looked again, the car was gone." A long pause. "Sarah, I want you to stay exactly where you are. Don't go back to your truck alone. I'm calling the real state police right now." 20 minutes later, 2 Oregon State Police cruisers pulled into the Pine Ridge truck stop. The officers, Sergeant Davis and Trooper Martinez, took Sarah's statement while reviewing security footage from the truck stop's cameras. What they found was deeply disturbing. The cameras had indeed captured the man with the sedan, just as Sarah had described. But they'd also captured something else. 2 other men in the white panel van, watching and apparently coordinating with the well-dressed stranger. When Sarah had refused to give the man a ride, the cameras showed all 3 men leaving in the van, abandoning the sedan entirely. "The car's stolen," Sergeant Davis told Sarah as they watched the footage. "Reported taken from a Portland hotel parking lot 3 days ago. The license plates are fake." "But what were they trying to do?" Sarah asked. Trooper Martinez, who specialized in crimes against commercial drivers, had a grim answer. "We've been tracking a pattern of incidents along this route. Truckers, mostly women, approached by well-dressed men with believable stories. The ones who stopped to help, some of them disappeared. The investigation that followed revealed a sophisticated operation targeting long-haul truckers. The fake breakdown was just the opening move. If a driver agreed to give the man a ride, they would be directed to pull over at a secluded location where accomplices waited. The trucks would be hijacked, their cargo stolen, and the drivers. The fate of the drivers was something investigators preferred not to discuss in detail. Sarah had unknowingly avoided becoming the seventh victim in a series that had been operating for over 18 months. Her instincts, her training, and perhaps most importantly, her attention to small details like the man's clean shoes had saved her life. The Pine Ridge incident led to the arrest of 5 men involved in the truck hijacking operation. During the investigation, authorities discovered that the group had developed detailed profiles of regular drivers along Western routes, knowing their schedules, their typical stopping points, even personal information about their families. They weren't just opportunistic criminals, Sergeant Davis explained to Sarah during a follow-up interview. They were hunters, studying their prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. The experience fundamentally changed how Sarah approached her job. She still helped stranded motorists when she could, but she developed new protocols for her own safety. She began traveling in loose convoys with other trusted drivers, maintaining radio contact and sharing information about unusual encounters. More importantly, she became an advocate for driver safety education, particularly for women in the trucking industry. The story of her encounter at Pine Ridge became a case study used in training programs across the country. "Trust your instincts," she would tell new drivers. "If something feels wrong, it probably is." Being helpful is part of who we are as truckers, but staying alive is more important than being polite. Today, Sarah still drives the same routes through Oregon and California, but she carries additional safety equipment: a dash camera, a satellite communicator, and a small canister of pepper spray. The Pine Ridge truck stop installed additional lighting and emergency call boxes in response to the incident. The blue sedan used in the attempted abduction was eventually traced to a chop shop operation in Portland, where it was being prepared for export. But the vehicle's history revealed something even more disturbing. It had been used in at least 4 other similar operations across 3 states, suggesting the truck hijacking ring was far larger than initially suspected. For truckers who still stop at Pine Ridge during the lonely hours of night shifts, Sarah's experience serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators often don't look threatening at all. They look like ordinary people with ordinary problems, people who need help, people whose stories appeal to the basic human decency that most drivers carry with them on the road. The well-dressed man who approached Sarah that night was never identified. He disappeared into the criminal underground like a ghost, probably to surface somewhere else with a different car, a different story, but the same patient predatory smile. But because one driver paid attention to details like clean shoes on a dusty night, because she trusted her instincts over her sympathy, he failed to claim another victim. And sometimes, on the long, empty highways of America, that's the difference between making it home to your family and becoming just another missing person report filed away in a forgotten folder. Sarah still thinks about that night sometimes, especially when she passes other stranded motorists on dark highways. She still helps when she can, but she does it on her terms, in public places, with backup nearby. Because she learned that the most important cargo any trucker carries isn't freight or goods or materials. It's themselves, and their obligation to the people waiting for them to come home safely. Mike Patterson had been running the midnight freight routes for 12 years when he first noticed the headlights. It was Thursday, November 8, 2018, and he was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Salt Lake City along Interstate 15, a route he knew like his own driveway. The road was nearly empty at 2:15 in the morning, just the occasional trucker and the rare insomniac making their way through the Nevada desert. The headlights appeared in his mirrors somewhere around the Arizona-Nevada border, two white points of light maintaining a steady distance behind his rig. Nothing unusual about that. Truckers often traveled in loose convoys for safety and company, matching speeds and staying in radio contact across the long, lonely stretches of highway. But these headlights were different. They never got closer, never fell back, never changed lanes to pass. They just held position exactly 300 yards behind Mike's trailer, as precise as if they were connected by an invisible chain. Mike reached for his CB radio. "Southbound traffic behind me on 15, you copy." Static answered him. He tried again. "Vehicle following me northbound on 15, just past mile marker 12. How about a radio check?" More static. That was odd. Most truckers monitored channel 19, and even if the vehicle behind him wasn't a commercial driver, plenty of regular folks kept CB radios for emergencies or entertainment. But whoever was back there wasn't talking. Mike adjusted his rearview mirror for a better look. The headlights were still there, unwavering in their distance and position. In 12 years of night driving, he'd developed good instincts about other vehicles on the road. Aggressive drivers rode your bumper and flashed their lights. Cautious drivers fell back when you slowed down and sped up when traffic cleared. Normal drivers varied their following distance naturally, unconsciously adjusting for curves and hills and changing conditions. These headlights did none of that. They maintained their position with mechanical precision, as if guided by some kind of automated system. By 3 o'clock, Mike was genuinely unnerved. The headlights had been following him for 45 minutes without deviation. He'd tried varying his speed, slowing down to 60, then speeding up to 75. The lights adjusted accordingly, always maintaining that exact same distance. He'd tried the radio every few minutes, cycling through multiple channels. Either the vehicle behind him had no radio, or the driver was deliberately refusing to respond. Most disturbing of all, Mike had begun to notice something impossible about the headlights themselves. They were too steady, too perfectly aligned. Real headlights bounced slightly as vehicles traveled over imperfect pavement. They shifted position as drivers made tiny steering corrections. They flickered when trees or overpasses created momentary shadows. These lights did none of that. They remained absolutely constant, as if they weren't attached to a vehicle at all but were somehow floating 300 yards behind him in perfect formation. At 3:20, Mike decided to test his growing suspicion. There was a truck stop coming up at the next exit, a 24-hour facility with good lighting and, more importantly, other people around. He activated his turn signal and began slowing for the exit ramp. The headlights followed. But here's what made Mike's skin crawl. The lights turned before his truck did. In his mirror, he watched them begin their turn while he was still in the straight lane, as if whoever was driving back there knew his intentions before he acted on them. Mike pulled into the truck stop and parked under the bright fluorescent lights near the fuel pumps. He climbed down from his cab and walked to the back of his trailer, pretending to check his cargo straps while actually positioning himself to get a clear look at his follower. The vehicle that pulled into the parking area behind him wasn't what he'd expected. It was a truck, a big rig like his own, but there was something fundamentally wrong with it. The tractor was an older model, maybe from the 70s, with a long nose and chrome that gleamed despite the age of the vehicle. It was painted a deep, dark blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the trailer that made Mike's breath catch in his throat. Instead of the typical white or silver of commercial trailers, this one was black. Not just black painted, but black in a way that seemed to create a void in the air, as if the trailer was a hole cut out of reality itself. And there was no driver. Mike could see clearly into the cab through the windshield. The seat was empty, the interior dark, but the engine was running, diesel exhaust visible in the cold night air. And the headlights that had been following him were definitely coming from this truck. A chill ran down Mike's spine that had nothing to do with the November weather. He walked closer, thinking maybe the driver was lying down in the sleeper berth or had stepped out the passenger side where Mike couldn't see him. But as he approached the truck, it began moving, not backing up or pulling forward, but rotating in place, as if the entire vehicle was slowly turning to keep its front end pointed directly at Mike. The movement was smooth and silent, except for the idle of the diesel engine. Mike stumbled backward, his rational mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Trucks don't rotate in place. They can't. The laws of physics, the limitations of steering geometry, the simple reality of how wheels and axles work, all of it said that what he was watching was impossible. But the truck continued its slow rotation until it was pointing directly at him, its empty cab staring at him like the eye sockets of a skull. Mike ran. He sprinted back to his own truck, fumbling with the door handle in his panic. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the other truck's engine increasing in RPM, as if it was preparing to move. Mike got his truck started and pulled out of the parking lot faster than was safe or legal, his heart hammering in his chest. In his mirrors, he could see the dark truck following, once again maintaining that precise 300-yard distance. For the next hour and a half, until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the phantom truck followed Mike through the Nevada desert. It matched his every move, anticipated his every turn, maintained its impossible precision of distance and position. As the sun came up, painting the mountains pink and gold, Mike expected the strange pursuit to end, but the truck behind him showed no signs of leaving. If anything, it seemed more solid in the daylight, more real, though no less impossible. At 6:30 in the morning, Mike pulled into a truck stop in Las Vegas, desperately needing fuel and hoping that daylight and other people might somehow break whatever spell had trapped him in this nightmare convoy. As he parked and shut down his engine, Mike watched in his mirrors for the dark truck to follow him into the lot. But the vehicle that appeared behind him wasn't the impossibly old blue and black rig he'd been seeing all night. It was a normal truck, a red Peterbilt with a white trailer, driven by a perfectly ordinary-looking man in his 50s. The driver waved at Mike as he parked nearby, the kind of friendly gesture truckers exchanged thousands of times every day. Mike sat in his cab, hands shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined the whole thing? Had fatigue and the isolation of night driving created some kind of hallucination? But his logbook told a different story. The timestamp showed that what should have been a 6-hour drive had taken nearly 8 hours. Somewhere during the night he'd lost almost 2 hours, time that had passed while he was being followed by something that couldn't exist. Mike climbed down from his cab and approached the driver of the red Peterbilt. The man was doing a routine inspection of his rig, checking lights and tire pressure. "Morning," Mike said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Did you happen to pass another truck on the way in?" Dark blue tractor, black trailer. The other driver looked up, squinting in the morning sun. "Nope, just you ahead of me for the last 50 miles or so." "Why?" "Nothing," Mike said quickly. "Just thought I saw someone I knew." But as he walked toward the truck stop diner for coffee, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. Not the intense, predatory attention he'd felt during the night, but a more distant observation, as if something was taking note of where he'd gone, what he'd done, who he'd talked to. Over breakfast, Mike tried to convince himself that he'd experienced some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Truckers worked long hours, dealt with irregular sleep schedules, spent countless hours alone with their thoughts. It wasn't unheard of for drivers to report strange experiences during particularly difficult runs. But when he returned to his truck and began his pre-trip inspection, Mike discovered something that shattered his rational explanations. On the back of his trailer, written in the dust that had accumulated during his overnight drive, was a message. "Thank you for the company. The night shift." The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, as if it had been traced by something that understood the concept of letters and words, but had no natural familiarity with human writing. Mike stared at the message for a long time, his mind racing through possible explanations. Could someone have written it while he was in the diner? But he'd been gone for less than 30 minutes, and his truck was parked where he could see it through the window. Could he have written it himself during some kind of fugue state? But he had no memory of doing so, and the handwriting didn't look like his own. More disturbing was the implication of the message itself. "Thank you for the company," suggested that whatever had followed him through the night had been lonely, that it had sought out his presence for companionship rather than malicious intent. The idea of a lonely ghost trucker, condemned to drive the highways forever in search of human contact, was somehow more unsettling than the thought of being stalked by something evil. Mike wiped the message off his trailer and continued his journey to Salt Lake City, but the incident haunted him. He found himself constantly checking his mirrors, scanning the horizon for signs of the dark blue truck. But his remaining drive passed without incident, and he made his delivery on schedule. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that Mike learned he wasn't alone in his experience. He was having coffee at a truck stop outside of Bakersfield when he overheard a conversation between two other drivers. One of them, a woman named Linda who ran regular routes between California and Arizona, was describing something that made Mike's blood run cold. "I'm telling you, it followed me for over 100 miles, Linda was saying. "Old blue truck, black trailer, never got closer, never fell back. And the weirdest part? No driver. The cab was completely empty." Mike approached their table. "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing. When did this happen?" Linda looked up at him with tired eyes. 2 nights ago, on I-15 between Barstow and Vegas. You ever see anything like that?" "As a matter of fact, I have," Mike said, sitting down uninvited. "Same route, about 3 weeks ago, same truck, same behavior." The third driver at the table, an older man named Carl who'd been listening quietly, suddenly looked very interested. "You guys talking about the shadow convoy?" "The what?" Linda asked. Carl leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've been driving these routes for 28 years, and I've been hearing stories about that truck for at least the last 10. Always the same description. Old blue tractor, black trailer, no driver, follows people for hours, then disappears." "But that's impossible," Linda protested. "Trucks don't drive themselves." "Tell that to the dozen or so drivers who've reported seeing it," Carl replied. "And here's the really weird part. It only shows up at night and only on certain routes. I-15 through Nevada, I-40 through Arizona and New Mexico, I-80 across Wyoming. Always the long, lonely stretches where truckers spend hours without seeing another soul." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. "You think it's... what? A ghost truck?" Carl shrugged. "I think there's a lot about this world we don't understand. I've seen things out there on the highway that don't make sense, experienced things that shouldn't be possible. The shadow convoy is just one of them." "But why?" Linda asked. "What does it want?" "Maybe it doesn't want anything," Carl said quietly. maybe it's just lonely. Think about it. If you were trapped somehow, condemned to drive the same routes forever, wouldn't you seek out the company of other drivers? Wouldn't you try to connect with the living, even if you couldn't communicate? The conversation stayed with Mike for months. He began researching the phenomenon, reaching out to other drivers, collecting stories of encounters with the mysterious truck. What he found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Over the past decade, at least 30 drivers had reported encounters with what they consistently described as an old blue truck with a black trailer and no visible driver. The encounters followed a pattern. The truck would appear suddenly in their mirrors, maintain perfect following distance for hours, then vanish as mysteriously as it had appeared. But Mike also discovered something else. According to accident reports and trucking industry records, there had been a fatal crash on I-15 in Nevada in November 2008, exactly 10 years before his own encounter. A driver named Robert Morrison, age 47, had been killed when his truck, described in the report as a blue 1976 Peterbilt pulling a black trailer, had gone off the road during a nighttime run. The crash report noted that Morrison had been driving alone and had maintained radio silence during his final hours, despite repeated attempts by his dispatcher to reach him. His truck had been found at the bottom of a ravine, completely destroyed. Morrison's body was never recovered. The crash had occurred on the same stretch of a highway where Mike had first noticed the following headlights. Mike tried to find more information about Robert Morrison, but the trail went cold quickly. The trucking company Morrison had worked for was out of business. His family, if he'd had one, had left no forwarding address. Official records showed only the basic facts. A middle-aged trucker had died in a single-vehicle accident on a lonely highway, and his body had never been found. But the encounters with the shadow convoy continued. Mike began keeping detailed notes of his own experiences. 3 more times over the following year, the mysterious truck appeared in his mirrors during night runs through Nevada. Each time, the pattern was identical. The truck would follow for hours, maintaining perfect distance, never responding to radio calls, then vanish when other vehicles or daylight appeared. And each time Mike found a message written in the dust on his trailer. "Thank you for the company, the night shift." Other drivers reported similar experiences. Linda, the woman he'd met at the Bakersfield truck stop, encountered the shadow convoy 4 more times. Each encounter left her shaken but unharmed. Carl, the veteran driver who'd first told them about the phenomenon, admitted that he'd been followed by the mysterious truck at least a dozen times over the years. "I've gotten used to it," he told Mike during one of their regular coffee meetings. "It's not trying to hurt anyone, it's just there, like it's completing a run that never ended." The theory that emerged from these conversations was both tragic and compelling. Robert Morrison had been a dedicated trucker, a man who'd spent his life on the highways of the American West. When he died in that crash 10 years ago, perhaps some part of him had been unable to accept that his final run was over. Perhaps he was still out there, trying to complete deliveries that would never be finished, seeking the companionship of other drivers to ease the loneliness of endless night shifts. Mike never saw the shadow convoy truck in daylight. It appeared only during the darkest hours, when the highway stretched empty and infinite ahead of lone drivers pushing through the night to make their deliveries on time. It never threatened, never interfered with anyone's actual driving, never caused accidents or delays. It just followed, patient and persistent, as if it was grateful for any company it could find on the lonely roads where truckers spend so much of their lives. The last time Mike encountered the shadow convoy was in October 2019, almost exactly a year after his first sighting. He was running late with a load bound for Denver, pushing hard through the Nevada desert to make up lost time. When the familiar headlights appeared in his mirrors, Mike felt an odd sense of relief rather than fear. "Evening, Robert," he said aloud, though he didn't use the radio. Somehow, he felt certain the other driver could hear him. Glad to have the company. For the next 3 hours, the two trucks traveled through the desert together, maintaining their precise formation across the empty highway. Mike found himself talking to the empty cab behind him, describing his cargo, sharing news from the road, filling the silence with the kind of casual conversation that had once passed between living drivers. When dawn began to break over the mountains, Mike looked in his mirrors one last time. The shadow convoy was fading with the darkness, becoming translucent in the growing light. "Drive safe out there, Robert," Mike said softly. "See you on the next run." The truck disappeared entirely as the sun cleared the horizon, but Mike could swear he heard a brief sound on the CB radio. 3 clicks of a microphone, the traditional trucker's farewell. Mike retired from long-haul driving 6 months later, taking a local delivery job that kept him close to home. He never encountered the shadow convoy again, but he continued to collect stories from other drivers who had. The encounters continued, always following the same pattern, always ending with the same grateful message written in trailer dust. For the truckers who still run the lonely night shifts through Nevada's desert highways, the shadow convoy has become a strange sort of comfort. Not everyone sees it, and not everyone who does chooses to talk about it. But among those who've experienced the phenomenon, there's an understanding that some drivers never really retire from the road. They just keep on trucking, completing runs that have no destination, carrying cargo that exists only in memory, seeking the companionship of the living to ease the burden of eternal night shifts on highways that stretch into forever. And sometimes, if you're driving alone through the Nevada desert in the darkest hours before dawn, you might notice a pair of headlights in your mirrors, following at exactly the right distance, never getting closer, never falling back. If that happens, you might want to talk to the empty air around you, share some of the road stories that make the miles pass faster. Because everyone deserves company on the long hauls, even drivers who've been making the same run for more than a decade, still trying to deliver a load that was lost in a ravine on a cold November night when the world forgot that Robert Morrison was just trying to get home. Danny Kowalski had seen plenty of bad weather in his 16 years of driving the upper Midwest routes, but nothing had prepared him for the storm that was bearing down on Interstate 29 through North Dakota on the night of February 23, 2020. The weather reports had been ominous all day. A massive blizzard system moving in from Canada, with wind speeds approaching 70 miles per hour, and snowfall rates that could reach 4 inches in a single hour. Most smart truckers had already pulled over, waiting out the worst of it in the safety of truck stops and rest areas. But Danny was carrying time-sensitive medical supplies to a hospital in Grand Forks, equipment needed for emergency surgeries scheduled for early the next morning. His dispatcher had made it clear that people's lives depended on this delivery, and Danny had never missed a critical run in his career. At 43, Danny was known throughout the company as the driver you called when absolutely, positively had to get through. He'd grown up in Minnesota, learned to drive in blizzards before most people learned to drive at all. His truck was equipped with the best tires, chains, and emergency equipment money could buy. If anyone could make it through this storm, it was Danny Kowalski. But as he drove north from Fargo at 8:15 that evening, Danny began to realize he might have bitten off more than he could chew. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 hours, but now it was intensifying rapidly. What had been large, lazy flakes when he'd started were now driving horizontally across his windshield, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. The wind was hitting his truck in powerful gusts that made the entire rig shudder and sway. Danny's CB radio crackled with urgent messages from other drivers who had already stopped for the night. "Northbound traffic on 29. You need to get off the road immediately," came a voice from somewhere behind him. "This thing's about to get really nasty." "Copy that," Danny replied into his microphone. "I'm hauling emergency medical supplies to Grand Forks. Hospitals depending on this delivery. Brother, I don't care what you're hauling. This storm's going to kill you if you keep driving in it." Danny appreciated the concern, but he'd made his decision. He reduced his speed to 40 miles per hour and kept pushing north, his truck's headlights cutting through the swirling white void ahead of him. By 9 o'clock, the situation had deteriorated dramatically. The wind was now hitting his truck with such force that he had to fight the steering wheel constantly to keep it on the road. Snow was accumulating faster than his wipers could clear it, and ice was forming on the glass despite his defroster running at maximum. Worse, the highway itself was becoming impassable. The snowplows had given up hours earlier, and the pavement was buried under at least 6 inches of powder, with deeper drifts forming wherever the wind could pile it up. Danny's truck was leaving the only tracks on the entire highway, a lonely set of tire prints that were being erased by the storm almost as quickly as he made them. At 9:20, Danny made a decision that would save his life, though he wouldn't realize it for hours. His fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, and he knew there was a truck stop at the next exit, about 12 miles ahead. If he could make it there, he could fuel up, wait for the worst of the storm to pass, and still make his delivery before the morning surgeries. But making it those 12 miles would prove to be the most harrowing experience of his driving career. The storm seemed to intensify with each mile, as if nature itself was determined to stop him from reaching safety. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The wind was now hitting sustained speeds that rocked his 40-ton rig like a child's toy. Worst of all, Danny began to lose all sense of where he was on the highway. The center lines were buried under snow. The shoulder markers were invisible. Even the roadside reflectors that normally provided guidance were obscured by the blizzard. Danny found himself navigating by instinct and memory, trying to stay roughly in the middle of what he hoped was still the highway. At 9:47, disaster struck. A particularly violent gust of wind hit Danny's truck from the side, strong enough to lift the trailer's rear wheels briefly off the pavement. As he fought to regain control, the truck slid sideways off the highway entirely, coming to rest at a sharp angle in the median strip between the northbound and southbound lanes. Danny tried to rock the truck back onto the road, alternating between forward and reverse, but the wheels just spun helplessly in the deep snow. He was stuck, completely and thoroughly, in the middle of one of the worst blizzards to hit North Dakota in decades. His first instinct was to call for help, but his cell phone showed no signal. The storm was so severe that it had knocked out communications across a wide area. His truck's satellite communication system was also down, probably due to the heavy snow interfering with the signal. Danny was alone, stranded in a blizzard that was getting worse by the minute, with no way to call for help, and no guarantee that anyone would even be looking for him until he failed to make his scheduled delivery the next morning. The temperature outside was already well below zero, and the wind chill was making it feel like 40 below. Danny's truck had enough fuel to keep the engine running for maybe 6 hours, providing heat and power. After that, he would be at the mercy of the storm. But Danny had prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. In the storage compartments behind his cab, he carried a comprehensive survival kit: extra food, water, blankets, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, emergency flares, and even a small camp stove with fuel. He'd never had to use most of it. but his years of driving through harsh winters had taught him to prepare for the worst. Danny shut down his engine to conserve fuel and began organizing his supplies. The cab of his truck would become his survival shelter for however long it took the storm to pass and rescue to arrive. He pulled on every layer of clothing he had, wrapped himself in blankets, and settled in to wait. But waiting, he soon discovered, was the hardest part. The storm raged around his truck with incredible fury. Wind gusts shook the entire rig so violently that Danny worried it might actually tip over. Snow piled up against the windows, gradually burying the cab until he felt like he was trapped inside an igloo. The temperature inside the truck dropped steadily as the metal walls conducted heat away faster than his body could produce it. By midnight, Danny was beginning to understand that this was going to be a fight for his life. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Weather reports on his battery-powered radio described it as a once-in-a-generation blizzard, with snow accumulations that could reach 3 feet and wind speeds that had actually increased since evening. Danny rationed his food and water carefully, knowing he might need to make his supplies last for days. Every few hours, he started the engine and ran the heater for 30 minutes, just enough to warm up the cab and prevent hypothermia from setting in. But each time he did this, he watched his fuel gauge drop another notch, knowing he was using up his most precious resource. The psychological challenge was almost worse than the physical one. The isolation was complete, the darkness outside absolute except for the occasional glimpse of swirling snow in his headlights. The constant roar of the wind made it impossible to hear anything else, cutting him off from the world as effectively as if he'd been transported to another planet. But Danny fought the despair that threatened to overwhelm him. He thought about his wife Jennifer, waiting at home in Minneapolis. He thought about his 2 teenage kids who would be worried sick if they knew where he was. Most of all, he thought about the medical supplies in his trailer, equipment, that surgeons would need to save lives in just a few hours. As dawn approached on February 24th, the storm finally began to show signs of weakening. The wind was still howling, but the snow wasn't falling quite as heavily. More importantly, Danny could see faint traces of gray light filtering through the white chaos outside his windows. But his situation was still desperate. His fuel was nearly gone, his battery was dying, and he was buried under so much snow that rescue teams might not even be able to see his truck from the highway. That's when Danny made a decision that would later be credited with saving his life. Using the last of his battery power, he activated his truck's emergency beacon system and then began setting off his emergency flares at regular intervals, placing them in the snow around his truck to create a visible signal for any rescue teams that might be searching for him. The flares burned bright red against the white landscape, creating a beacon that could be seen for miles across the flat Dakota prairie. Danny continued setting them off every 30 minutes, using up his entire supply to maintain a continuous signal. At 10:15 that morning, Danny heard the most beautiful sound of his life, the deep rumble of heavy equipment approaching through the snow. A North Dakota Department of Transportation snowplow, equipped with GPS and searching for stranded vehicles, had spotted the red glow of his flares from over a mile away. The rescue took another 3 hours. The snowplow had to clear a path through drifts that reached 8 feet in some places, and it took 2 tow trucks working together to pull Danny's rig back onto the highway. But by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Danny was free, alive, and ready to complete his delivery to Grand Forks. The medical supplies he was carrying arrived at the hospital 18 hours later than scheduled, but they arrived intact and usable. 3 emergency surgeries that had been postponed because of the storm were able to proceed, and all 3 patients made full recoveries. Danny's survival story made headlines throughout the trucking industry and led to improvements in emergency protocols for drivers caught in severe weather. His company equipped all their trucks with enhanced survival gear and satellite communication systems that could function even in the worst conditions. But for Danny himself, the experience left him with a deeper appreciation for the risks that truckers face every day, and the thin line between routine runs and life-threatening emergencies. "People see us out there on the highway and think it's just a job," he said during an interview with a trucking magazine 6 months after the incident. "They don't realize that sometimes we're literally risking our lives to keep the supply chain moving, to get critical supplies where they need to be when they need to be there." Danny still drives the northern routes through Minnesota and North Dakota, but he carries even more emergency equipment now, and he's not shy about pulling over when conditions get dangerous. The storm that nearly killed him taught him that no delivery, no matter how critical, is worth dying for. Today, a small plaque at the truck stop where Danny had been trying to reach that night commemorates what became known as the Valentine's Day blizzard of 2020. The plaque bears a simple message: "In memory of the drivers who didn't make it home, and in honor of those who did." For truckers who still run the northern plains during winter storms, Danny's story serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. It reminds them that survival sometimes comes down to preparation, determination, and the simple refusal to give up when everything seems hopeless. And on those dark winter nights when the wind is howling across the prairie and the snow is falling so hard you can barely see your own headlights, drivers remember Danny Kowalski, who spent 14 hours buried in a blizzard and lived to tell about it, who proved that sometimes the most important cargo a trucker carries is the stubborn determination to make it home alive. Carol Henderson had been driving the Southwest Corridor for 11 years when she encountered the fake police officer on Interstate 40, just east of Flagstaff, Arizona. It was 3:30 in the morning on April 16, 2019, and she was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Dallas, making good time through the high desert country that she'd grown to love during her years on the road. At 51, Carol was one of the most experienced female drivers at Desert Wind Transport, known for her meticulous attention to safety and her ability to handle difficult loads through challenging terrain. She'd driven through snowstorms in the Rockies, sandstorms in Nevada, and hurricanes along the Gulf Coast. But nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for what was about to happen on that quiet stretch of Arizona highway. The first sign of trouble came as flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirrors, the unmistakable signal of a law enforcement vehicle requesting a traffic stop. Carol's heart sank as she began looking for a safe place to pull over. She'd been monitoring her speed carefully and knew she hadn't been exceeding the limit, but sometimes officers stopped commercial vehicles for routine inspections or to check paperwork. Carol found a wide spot on the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead and brought her rig to a careful stop, following all the protocols she'd learned in defensive driving courses. She turned on her hazard lights, engaged the parking brake, and prepared her commercial driver's license, registration, and logbook for inspection. In her side mirror, she watched as a white SUV with overhead light bars pulled up behind her truck. The vehicle looked official enough, though something about it struck her as slightly off. The light pattern wasn't quite right, and she couldn't make out any agency markings in the darkness. A man approached her cab from the rear, staying in her blind spot until he was right beside her door. When he stepped into the light of her side mirrors, Carol got her first good look at him and immediately felt uneasy. The man appeared to be in his 30s, wearing what looked like a generic security uniform rather than the distinctive clothing of any specific law enforcement agency. His badge, visible on his chest, was too shiny and appeared to be a cheap replica of a real police badge. Most disturbing of all, he wasn't following proper traffic stop procedures. Real law enforcement officers approaching commercial vehicles at night always stay visible, use flashlights to illuminate themselves, and call out their agency and purpose before reaching the driver's door. This man had done none of those things. "Evening, ma'am," the man said when Carol rolled down her window. "I'm Officer Johnson with the Arizona Highway Patrol. I need to conduct a routine inspection of your vehicle." Carol's uneasiness increased. She'd been stopped by the real Arizona Highway Patrol dozens of times over the years, and this man's uniform was nothing like theirs. More importantly, his manner was wrong. Real officers were professional, but also cautious, maintaining proper distance and following established procedures. This man was standing too close to her truck, and his body language was more aggressive than professional. "Can I see your identification?" Carol asked, stalling for time while she tried to figure out what was happening. The man flashed his badge quickly, holding it too far away and at an angle that made it difficult to read in the dim light. "I need you to step down from the vehicle, ma'am. This will just take a few minutes." Every instinct Carol had developed during 11 years of safe driving was screaming at her that something was very wrong. Real officers conducting routine inspections didn't ask drivers to exit their vehicles unless there was a specific safety concern. They certainly didn't do it on dark highways in the middle of the night without backup. "I'd prefer to stay in my cab," Carol said politely but firmly. "If you need to inspect my paperwork, I can hand it down to you." The man's expression changed, becoming noticeably less friendly. "Ma'am, I'm giving you a direct order to exit your vehicle. If you don't comply, I'll have to place you under arrest." That's when Carol knew for certain that she was dealing with someone impersonating a police officer. Real law enforcement officers didn't threaten arrest for asking to see proper identification or for following safety protocols. They also didn't conduct traffic stops alone on isolated highways without calling in their location and the vehicle they were stopping. Carol's training kicked in. At Desert Wind Transport, all drivers received instruction on how to handle encounters with suspicious individuals claiming to be law enforcement. The first rule was never to exit your vehicle if you had any doubts about the officer's authenticity. "I'm going to need to call this into my dispatcher," Carol said, reaching for her cell phone. "Company policy requires me to report all traffic stops." "Don't touch that phone," the man snapped, his hand moving to something on his belt. "Turn off your engine and step out of the truck right now." Carol could see that he was reaching for what appeared to be a weapon, though she couldn't tell if it was a gun or something else. She made a decision that would save her life. Instead of complying with his demands, she put her truck in gear and drove away. The man shouted something behind her, but Carol couldn't hear it over the sound of her diesel engine accelerating. In her mirrors, she could see him running back toward his SUV, clearly intending to pursue her. Carol grabbed her CB radio and broadcast an emergency call on Channel 19. "Mayday, Mayday. This is eastbound commercial vehicle on I-40 near mile marker 201. I'm being pursued by someone impersonating a police officer. Request immediate assistance from real law enforcement." The response was immediate and reassuring. "Roger. Eastbound commercial. This is westbound cattle hauler about 10 miles ahead of you. Real Arizona State Patrol is en route to your location. Keep your speed up and stay on the radio." Behind her, the white SUV had begun pursuit, its emergency lights flashing. But Carol noticed something that confirmed her suspicions. The vehicle was having trouble keeping up with her truck. Real police interceptors are built for high-speed pursuit, but this SUV was clearly struggling to match her speed even though she was driving a heavily loaded commercial vehicle. "Eastbound commercial. What's your situation?" came another voice on the radio. "Still being pursued by the fake officer," Carol replied. Vehicle appears to be a white SUV with aftermarket emergency lights. Driver is definitely not legitimate law enforcement. Copy that. State patrol units are approaching from both directions. They'll have him boxed in within 5 minutes. Carol could see headlights approaching from ahead, and her CB radio crackled with the voice of a real Arizona State Trooper. Commercial vehicle, this is Trooper Martinez with the Arizona Highway Patrol. I can see your truck ahead. Maintain your current speed and position. We have the situation under control. What happened next unfolded quickly. The pursuing SUV, apparently realizing that real law enforcement was closing in, suddenly veered off the highway at the next exit, abandoning the pursuit. Carol pulled over safely and waited while the state troopers pursued the fake officer's vehicle. The man was arrested 20 minutes later at a gas station 3 miles from the highway. When officers searched his SUV, they found a disturbing collection of items: zip ties, duct tape, a stun gun, and detailed maps marking the locations of rest stops and truck parking areas throughout the Southwest. The investigation that followed revealed that Carol had narrowly escaped becoming the victim of a predator who had been targeting commercial drivers for over 18 months. James Morrison, the man who had impersonated a police officer, was connected to at least 6 other incidents where truckers had reported suspicious traffic stops by someone claiming to be law enforcement. In 2 of those cases, drivers had complied with the fake officer's demands and exited their vehicles. Both had been robbed and assaulted, though they had managed to escape before Morrison could carry out whatever his ultimate intentions were. Investigators believed that Carol's quick thinking and refusal to comply with his orders had prevented a much more serious crime. She did everything right, Trooper Martinez told reporters after Morrison's arrest. She questioned the officer's identity when something seemed wrong. She refused to put herself in a vulnerable position, and she used her radio to call for help. Her actions probably saved her life. The case sent shockwaves through the trucking industry and led to enhanced training programs on how to identify legitimate law enforcement officers and what to do when encountering suspicious individuals claiming to be police. Carol became an advocate for driver safety education, sharing her story at truck stops and industry conferences throughout the Southwest. Her experience became a case study used in training programs across the country. Trust your instincts, she would tell other drivers. If something doesn't feel right about a traffic stop, it probably isn't right. Real officers won't object to you asking for proper identification or calling your dispatcher to report the stop. The incident also prompted changes in how legitimate law enforcement agencies conduct traffic stops involving commercial vehicles. Many departments now use standardized procedures that include calling out their agency name and badge number, maintaining proper distance from vehicles, and allowing drivers to verify their identity through dispatch. James Morrison was eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison for multiple counts of impersonating a police officer, attempted kidnapping, and assault. During his trial, investigators revealed that he had been systematically targeting commercial drivers because he believed they were more likely to carry cash and less likely to be immediately missed if something happened to them. He was a predator who exploited people's natural tendency to comply with authority figures, the prosecutor told the court. He counted on drivers being cooperative and trusting, and he used those qualities against them. Today, Carol still drives the Southwest roads, but she carries additional safety equipment and has developed protocols for verifying the identity of anyone who claims to be a law enforcement officer. Her truck is equipped with a dash camera that records both forward and rear views, and she maintains regular radio contact with other drivers when traveling through isolated areas. The stretch of Interstate 40, where Carol encountered Morrison, has since been equipped with additional emergency call boxes and increased patrol coverage. But for truckers who travel those lonely highways at night, Her story serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from road conditions or mechanical failures, but from predators who understand how to exploit the trust and cooperation that are fundamental to American highway culture. The vast majority of police officers are professional people doing a difficult job, Carol says when she tells her story. But there are always going to be people who try to take advantage of our respect for law enforcement. The key is knowing how to tell the difference, and never being afraid to ask questions when something doesn't seem right. For female truckers especially, Carol's experience has become a powerful example of how preparation, training, and quick thinking can mean the difference between becoming a victim and making it home safely. Her refusal to exit her vehicle despite threats and intimidation, and her immediate use of radio communication to summon help, are now taught as textbook examples of proper response to suspicious traffic stops. And on the CB radios that crackle with conversation across America's highways every night, drivers still share Carol Henderson's story, passing along the hard-learned wisdom that saved her life. When someone claiming to be a police officer doesn't act like a real police officer, trust your instincts and drive away. Real cops will understand, and fake cops will reveal themselves by what they do next. Jake Morrison had been hearing the voice on his CB radio for 3 weeks before he realized that the person talking to him was dead. It started on a Tuesday night in October 2021, somewhere between Amarillo and Oklahoma City on Interstate 40. Jake was hauling a load of construction equipment, making his regular run from Texas to Missouri, a route he'd driven probably 100 times in his 8 years with Lone Star Freight. The weather was perfect. Clear skies with a comfortable 68 degrees, the kind of night that made you remember why you'd chosen the trucking life in the first place. Jake had always been a talker on the CB. Channel 19 was like a lifeline during those long, lonely stretches of highway, connecting drivers across thousands of miles of American road. You'd share weather reports, traffic updates, warn about speed traps, or just pass the time with casual conversation. It was part of the culture, part of what made the trucking community feel like a family, even when you were hundreds of miles from home. That Tuesday night, Jake was feeling particularly chatty. His wife Linda had called earlier to tell him their daughter Emma had made the high school honor roll, and he was in the mood to share some good news with whoever might be listening. Eastbound on 40, approaching the Texas-Oklahoma line, he said into his microphone. Beautiful night out here. Anybody else enjoying this perfect weather? The response came back immediately, clear as if the person was sitting right next to him. Roger that, eastbound. This is northbound freight running parallel to you about 10 miles south. Weather's been perfect all day. Name's Eddie. What's your handle? Jake's fine, Eddie. Good to hear another voice out here. What you hauling? Appliances mostly, refrigerators and washers headed up to Kansas City. You? Construction equipment bound for St. Louis. Been running this route for years. Don't think I've heard your voice before. There was a pause, then a chuckle that sounded slightly hollow through the radio static. Yeah, I don't get on the radio much these days. Used to talk all the time, but, well, things change. Jake found the response a little odd, but truck drivers were a diverse bunch with all kinds of personalities. Some were chatterboxes who'd talk your ear off. Others barely said 2 words during an entire run. Maybe Eddie was just getting back into the habit of using his radio. They talked for the next hour, the kind of easy conversation that develops between truckers sharing the road. Eddie asked about Jake's family, talked about the changes he'd seen in the industry over the years, shared stories about difficult loads and memorable trips. His voice had a slightly nostalgic quality, as if he was remembering things from a long time ago, but the conversation was pleasant and helped make the miles pass quickly. As Jake approached the Oklahoma border, Eddie's voice crackled through the speaker again. "Jake, I'm going to have to sign off here. My route takes me north while you're continuing east. Drive safe out there, and maybe we'll cross paths again sometime." "You bet, Eddie. Thanks for the company. Keep the shiny side up." "Always do, partner. Catch you on the flip side." Jake thought nothing more about the conversation until the following Tuesday, when he was running the same route at almost exactly the same time. As he approached the Texas-Oklahoma border, his radio crackled to life with a familiar voice. "Eastbound on 40, approaching the Texas-Oklahoma line. Beautiful night out here. Anybody else enjoying this perfect weather?" Jake nearly dropped his microphone. Those were his exact words from the previous week, spoken in his own voice, coming through his radio from someone else's transmission. "Eddie?" Jake called out, confused. "That you, buddy?" "Roger that, eastbound. This is northbound freight running parallel to you about 10 miles south. Weather's been perfect all day. Name's Eddie. What's your handle?" It was the same conversation, word for word, as if someone was playing back a recording of their previous exchange. But that was impossible. CB radios don't record conversations, and even if they did, why would someone be replaying their chat from a week ago? Jake decided to test his theory. Instead of responding with his name as he had the previous week, he said something different. "This is Jake, Eddie, but haven't we talked before? Last Tuesday night, same place, same time." Silence stretched for almost a minute before Eddie's voice came back, but this time it sounded different, more distant and slightly confused. "Jake, yeah, maybe we have. Time gets a little mixed up out here sometimes. What were we talking about?" "You were hauling appliances to Kansas City. I was carrying construction equipment to St. Louis." Right, appliances. That sounds familiar." Eddie's voice had an odd quality now, as if he was trying to remember something important but couldn't quite grasp it. "Jake, can I ask you something? What year is it?" The question sent a chill down Jake's spine. "It's 2021, Eddie. October 2021. A long pause. 2021. That seems wrong somehow. I could have sworn it was..." His voice trailed off, then came back stronger. "Never mind. Must be more tired than I thought. What did you say you were hauling?" They talked for another 45 minutes, but the conversation felt different this time. Eddie seemed confused about details, asked the same questions multiple times, and his stories didn't quite line up with what he'd said the week before. When they signed off, Jake was left with a deep sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The following Tuesday, it happened again. Same time, same place, same initial exchange played back in Jake's own voice. But this time, when Eddie responded, his voice sounded even more distant and confused. "Eddie, this is Jake. We've talked the last 2 weeks. Same stretch of road, same time. Do you remember?" "Jake, yeah, I remember you. But it feels like it was just yesterday, or maybe years ago. Time's funny out here on the road, isn't it?" "Eddie, where exactly are you right now? What mile marker?" "Mile marker? I'm not sure. The signs all look the same after a while. I'm northbound, I know that much. Been driving north for a long time now." Jake pulled over at the next rest area and tried to make sense of what was happening. He'd been a trucker long enough to know that the road could play tricks on your mind, especially during long night runs. But this was different. This felt like something impossible was happening. Something that challenged everything he understood about reality. Over the next several weeks, Jake began to research CB radio anomalies. Atmospheric conditions that might cause strange transmissions. Anything that might explain what he was experiencing. What he found instead was something that made his blood run cold. Eddie Kowalczyk had been a real trucker, a 43-year-old driver for Midwest Transport who'd been killed in a single-vehicle accident on a farm road in western Oklahoma 3 years earlier. According to the accident report, Eddie had been driving northbound from Texas to Kansas City on October the 15th, 2018, when his truck had left the highway for unknown reasons and crashed into a bridge abutment. He'd died instantly. The accident had occurred on a Tuesday night, at almost exactly the same time Jake had been hearing Eddie's voice on the radio. But the discovery of Eddie's death didn't stop the weekly conversations. If anything, they became more frequent and more disturbing. Eddie began talking about things that didn't make sense, places that didn't exist, loads he'd never actually hauled. "I'm running this route to Kansas City," Eddie would say, his voice becoming more ethereal each week. "But I can't seem to get there. Keep driving north, but the miles don't count down like they should. Sign says Kansas City 200 miles, then 100 miles later, it still says 200 miles. Jake found himself becoming obsessed with these conversations. He began timing his runs to ensure he'd be on that stretch of Interstate 40 every Tuesday night at the same time. He started recording the exchanges, though when he played them back later, Eddie's voice was often inaudible, replaced by static or silence. Other truckers began to notice Jake's strange behavior. During the day, he would ask other drivers if they'd ever heard of Eddie Kowalczyk, if they'd experienced unusual CB transmissions, if they believed in ghost stories. Most just shook their heads and walked away, but a few had their own stories to tell. Bill Henderson, a veteran driver with 30 years on the road, pulled Jake aside at a truck stop in Tulsa. "You're asking about Eddie Kowalczyk," Bill said. "I knew Eddie, good driver, reliable guy. Terrible thing what happened to him." "You knew him personally?" "Worked for the same company for a while, back in 17 and 18. We'd run into each other at truck stops, share a cup of coffee and road stories. He was obsessed with getting home to his family, always pushing to make his deliveries early so he could spend more time with his kids." Bill paused, studying Jake's face. "Why are you asking about Eddie?" Jake told him about the radio conversations, the weekly encounters, Eddie's confusion about time and location. Bill listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Jake, Eddie never made it to Kansas City that night," Bill said quietly. "According to the accident report, he was trying to make up time by taking back roads instead of staying on the interstate. Probably fell asleep at the wheel, or maybe had a medical emergency. Point is, he died trying to complete that last run. But I've been talking to him every week for 2 months." "Maybe you have," Bill said. "There's things out here on the road that don't make sense, things that defy explanation. I've been driving long enough to know that the highway holds on to things sometimes, especially when someone died with unfinished business." The conversation with Bill led Jake to dig deeper into Eddie's background. He contacted Eddie's former employer, spoke with his widow, even visited the crash site where Eddie had died. What emerged was the picture of a dedicated family man who'd taken the trucking job specifically to provide for his wife and 3 young children. Eddie's widow, Marie, was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually she opened up about her husband's final months. "He was so tired all the time," she told Jake during a phone conversation. "Working extra runs, trying to save money for the kids' college funds. I kept telling him to slow down, that the money wasn't worth risking his health, but he was determined to build a better life for us." "Did he ever talk about his runs to Kansas City?" "All the time. He loved that route, said it was one of the easier ones. Straight shot north on good highways, reliable delivery schedules. The night he died, he called me from Amarillo. Said he was making great time and would be home by Thursday morning." Marie's voice caught. "He never made it home, Jake." They found him Wednesday morning in that wreck, still buckled into his seat. Coroner said he probably died instantly when the truck hit the bridge. But Jake's weekly conversations with Eddie continued, and they began to reveal more details about what Eddie was experiencing. The dead trucker seemed to be trapped in an endless loop, forever trying to complete his final delivery, forever driving north toward a destination he could never reach. "Jake, I'm starting to recognize some of these landmarks," Eddie said during one conversation. "Feel like I've passed this same grain elevator dozens of times, but that's impossible, isn't it? I mean, I'm making progress. The miles are clicking by." "Eddie, how long do you think you've been driving?" "Tonight? Maybe 4 hours, but it feels longer somehow." "Jake, can I ask you something? Do you remember what your family looks like? I mean, really remember, not just general impressions?" The question chilled Jake. "Of course I remember. My wife Linda, my daughter Emma, I talk to them every day." "That's good. That's really good. Sometimes I try to picture Marie and the kids, but their faces are getting fuzzy, like looking at a photograph that's fading." Jake began to understand that Eddie wasn't just a ghost or a recording trapped in the airwaves. He was a soul in limbo, unable to move on because he'd never completed his final run, never made it home to his family one last time. The realization led Jake to make a decision that would change both their lives. During their next Tuesday night conversation, Jake proposed something that had never been tried before. "Eddie, what if I could complete your run for you? What if I could deliver your load to Kansas City?" "Jake, what are you talking about? My load was destroyed in the crash. There's nothing left to deliver." "Maybe not physically, but you're still carrying it in your mind, aren't you? You're still trying to complete that delivery. What if we could finish it together?" Eddie's voice was quiet for a long moment. "I don't understand. I'm going to Kansas City next week anyway. What if I make the delivery for you? What if I call your dispatcher, tell them Eddie Kowalczyk's final load has been completed?" That's crazy, Jake, but what? "But it might work. I've been stuck here for 3 years, trying to finish this run. Maybe if someone else completes it for me, I can finally go home." Jake spent the following week preparing for what he hoped would be Eddie's final delivery. He researched the company Eddie had worked for, found that it was still in business. He learned the details of Eddie's last load, the delivery address in Kansas City, even the name of the receiving dock supervisor. The following Tuesday, Jake made sure he was carrying a load bound for Kansas City. As he drove through Oklahoma, he kept his CB radio on, waiting for Eddie's voice. "Eddie, you there, partner?" "I'm here, Jake. You really going to try this?" "We're going to try this together. I want you to ride with me to Kansas City. Guide me to the delivery location. Help me complete your run." What followed was the strangest night of Jake's driving career. With Eddie's voice providing directions and encouragement, Jake navigated through Kansas City to a warehouse district he'd never visited before. Eddie guided him turn by turn, his directions becoming clearer and more confident as they approached their destination. "Turn left at the next light, Jake. The warehouse should be about a half-mile down on your right." "How can you see where we're going, Eddie?" "I don't know, but I can sense it. After 3 years of trying to find this place, I can finally sense where it is." They pulled into the warehouse lot at 4:30 in the morning. The facility was closed, but Jake parked his truck exactly where Eddie directed him, in the spot where Eddie's truck should have arrived 3 years earlier. "Jake, I want to thank you for this. I never thought I'd make it here." "You're welcome, partner, but this isn't over yet. Tomorrow morning, when the warehouse opens, I'm going to go in there and tell them that Eddie Kowalczyk's final delivery has been completed." "You'd do that for me? We're truckers, Eddie. We look out for each other." The next morning, Jake approached the warehouse supervisor, a man named Tom Bradley who'd been working at the facility for over a decade. Jake explained that he was completing a delivery that had been interrupted by a fatal accident 3 years earlier. Tom looked confused at first, but then his expression changed. Eddie Kowalczyk? Jesus, I remember that name. We were expecting a delivery from him, but he never showed up. Found out later he'd been killed in a crash. That's right, I'm here to complete his delivery. Tom stared at Jake for a long moment. Son, that delivery was written off years ago. The insurance company paid the claim, we found another supplier. There's nothing left to complete. Maybe not officially, Jake said, but Eddie's still out there trying to finish the job. I think he needs someone to tell him it's done, that his final run is complete. Tom Bradley had been in the trucking business long enough to understand the dedication drivers felt to completing their runs. He'd known truckers who'd driven through blizzards, floods, and personal crises to make their deliveries on time. The idea that a driver might somehow continue trying to complete a run even after death didn't seem impossible to him. All right, Tom said finally. Eddie Kowalczyk's final delivery to Bradley Warehouse is officially complete. Will you tell him that for me? That evening, as Jake prepared to leave Kansas City, he tried his CB radio one last time. Eddie, you copy? The response came back weak but clear. I'm here, Jake. Eddie, I talked to Tom Bradley at the warehouse. He says Eddie Kowalczyk's final delivery is officially complete. Your run is finished, partner. There was a long silence. Then Eddie's voice came back one last time, stronger and clearer than Jake had ever heard it. Jake, I can see them. I can see Marie and the kids. They're waiting for me. Go to them, Eddie. Your work here is done. Thank you, Jake. Thank you for helping me get home. Jake never heard Eddie's voice on the CB radio again. The weekly conversations, which had become such a strange routine in his life, simply ended. But other truckers reported occasional encounters with a grateful voice on Channel 19, someone who thanked them for their dedication to the job and reminded them to drive safely. 3 months later, Jake received a letter from Marie Kowalczyk. She'd heard about what he'd done through the trucking community, how he'd completed her husband's final run and helped bring him peace. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or spirits or life after death, she wrote, but I know that Eddie loved his job and loved providing for his family. The idea that he was somehow still out there, still trying to complete that last delivery makes sense to me. And the idea that a fellow trucker would help him finish what he started, that makes me believe that there's still good in this world. Jake still drives the Texas-Oklahoma route every Tuesday night, though he times his runs differently now. He's never heard Eddie's voice again, but sometimes, when the road is dark and the CB is quiet, he feels a presence in the cab with him, a reminder that the trucking community extends beyond the boundaries of life and death. Other drivers have reported similar experiences on highways across the country. Voices on the radio that belong to truckers who died with unfinished runs, still trying to complete deliveries that were never made. Some drivers ignore these transmissions, dismissing them as atmospheric anomalies or overactive imaginations. But Jake knows better now. He knows that sometimes the most important cargo a trucker carries isn't freight or goods or materials. Sometimes it's the responsibility to help a fellow driver complete one final run, to ensure that no one has to drive the highways alone, even in death. And on quiet Tuesday nights when his CB crackles with a lonely voice asking for directions home, Jake always answers. Because that's what truckers do. They look out for each other mile after mile, load after load, until every run is complete and every driver makes it home. Frank Delacroix had been through the Barstow way station probably 200 times in his 15-year career, hauling freight between Los Angeles and Phoenix. but he'd never seen it like this. It was 3:45 in the morning on November 3rd, 2020, and the facility that should have been closed and empty was buzzing with activity that made absolutely no sense. Frank was driving his regular Tuesday night run, a load of automotive parts bound for a plant in Tempe. The route took him east on Interstate 10 through the Mojave Desert, past the sprawling truck stops and travel plazas that served the endless stream of commercial traffic moving between California and Arizona. The Barstow Way Station was a familiar landmark, a California Department of Transportation facility where trucks were randomly selected for weight and safety inspections during business hours. At 4 in the morning, the station should have been dark and deserted, its electronic signs reading "closed" and its inspection bays empty. But as Frank crested the hill approaching the facility, he could see bright lights illuminating the entire complex, and what appeared to be several trucks in the inspection lanes. Frank's first thought was that there might be some kind of emergency operation underway. Sometimes state authorities conducted special enforcement sweeps, targeting trucks that used nighttime hours to avoid inspection. But as he got closer to the station, he realized that what he was seeing didn't match any kind of official operation he'd ever encountered. The trucks in the inspection bays were old, much older than the modern rigs that typically ran the I-10 corridor. Frank could make out the distinctive outlines of vintage Peterbilts and Kenworths, trucks that looked like they belonged in museums rather than active service. Even more puzzling, the inspectors moving around the vehicles were wearing uniforms that looked decades out of date. Frank's CB radio crackled to life as he passed the station. "Westbound traffic. You need to pull in for inspection." The voice was clear and authoritative, exactly what you'd expect from a DOT inspector. But Frank was eastbound, not westbound. More importantly, the station was supposed to be closed. "This is eastbound grain hauler," Frank replied. "Station shows closed on my end." "Negative, eastbound. Station is fully operational. Please proceed to lane 3 for inspection." Frank looked at the electronic signs as he passed them. They clearly displayed "closed" in bright red letters, but his radio was telling him to stop for inspection. He'd been driving long enough to know that ignoring a direct order from DOT could result in serious penalties, but he'd also never encountered a situation this contradictory. "CB break. Any other drivers see activity at Barstow Way Station?" Frank called out on Channel 19. Static answered him for several seconds, then a voice came back. "This is southbound cattle hauler about 20 miles behind you. Passed Barstow about an hour ago. Station was dark and closed like always." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. He just passed the station minutes ago, and it had been brilliantly lit with multiple trucks being inspected. But another driver claimed to have seen it dark and empty just an hour earlier. "Eastbound grain hauler. You are ordered to return for mandatory inspection." The official voice came through his radio again. "Failure to comply will result in citation and possible arrest." Frank pulled over at the next rest area and tried to make sense of what he'd experienced. His logbook showed the correct time and date, his GPS confirmed his location, and his radio was functioning normally. But he'd apparently seen a way station operating at full capacity in the middle of the night, while another driver had seen it closed and empty just an hour earlier. Frank decided to investigate. He turned his truck around and headed back toward Barstow, intending to get a closer look at whatever was happening at the station. But when he reached the location, the facility was exactly as it should have been: dark, empty, with closed signs clearly visible. There were no trucks in the inspection bays, no inspectors moving around the facility, no lights except for the standard security illumination that kept the area minimally visible. It looked exactly like every other closed way station Frank had passed during 15 years of night driving. But his radio crackled again with the same authoritative voice. "Eastbound grain hauler. Report to lane 3 immediately for inspection." Frank stared at the dark facility, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he was seeing. There was clearly no one at the station, no way for anyone to be issuing inspection orders. But the voice on his radio sounded completely legitimate, exactly like the DOT inspectors he'd dealt with hundreds of times during his career. "Where are you broadcasting from?" Frank asked into his microphone. "California Department of Transportation Barstow Inspection Facility. You are required to submit to inspection procedures immediately." Frank climbed down from his cab and walked toward the station entrance. Motion sensor lights activated as he approached, but the facility was clearly unoccupied. The inspection bays were empty, the office windows were dark, and there were no vehicles anywhere in the complex except his own truck. Yet his radio continued to crackle with instructions from someone claiming to be a DOT inspector. "Eastbound grain hauler. Your delay is being noted in our records. Proceed to inspection lane immediately or face federal charges." Frank returned to his truck, thoroughly spooked but uncertain how to proceed. He'd never encountered anything like this in 15 years of commercial driving. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was experiencing some kind of radio malfunction or atmospheric anomaly. But the voice giving him orders sounded completely authentic, and the threat of federal charges was not something any trucker took lightly. Against his better judgment, Frank decided to play along with whatever was happening. He drove his truck into inspection lane 3, following the painted lines exactly as he would during a normal inspection. The motion sensors activated additional lighting, but the lane remained empty except for his truck. "Shut down your engine and exit the vehicle," the voice commanded through his radio. Frank complied, stepping down from his cab into the cool desert air. The silence was absolute except for the ticking of his cooling engine and the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 10. "Proceed to the rear of your trailer and await further instructions." Frank walked to the back of his trailer, feeling increasingly ridiculous. He was following orders from a voice on the radio while standing alone in an empty way station at 4 in the morning. But something compelled him to continue. A nagging sense that he was part of something much larger and more significant than a simple radio malfunction. "Open your trailer doors for cargo inspection." Frank unlocked and opened his trailer doors, revealing neat rows of boxed automotive parts secured with load straps. The cargo was exactly what his manifest indicated, properly loaded and secured according to all applicable regulations. "Inspection complete," the voice announced after several minutes of silence. "Violation noted for improper cargo securement. Report to office for citation." Frank stared at his load in confusion. He'd been loading and securing cargo for 15 years, and his tie-down job was textbook perfect. Every strap was properly tensioned, every box was adequately supported, every regulation was followed to the letter. There was no possible violation in his cargo securement, but he walked toward the office building anyway, following the painted path that led to the inspection station's administrative facilities. The motion sensors activated more lighting as he approached, but the office windows remained dark and obviously unoccupied. Frank tried the door handle, expecting it to be locked. To his surprise, the door opened easily, revealing a waiting area that looked exactly as he remembered from previous inspections. Chairs lined the walls, bulletin boards displayed current regulations and announcements, and a service counter separated the waiting area from the inspector's workspace. But something was wrong with the details. The bulletin boards displayed information that was years out of date, showing trucking regulations and safety requirements from the early 2000s. The furniture looked older than Frank remembered, and the overall atmosphere of the office felt like stepping back in time. "Take a seat and wait to be called," the voice instructed through speakers mounted in the ceiling. Frank sat in one of the plastic chairs, feeling increasingly surreal about the entire situation. He was alone in a government office that should have been locked and empty, following instructions from someone he couldn't see, waiting for an inspection that couldn't possibly be legitimate. After about 10 minutes, a door opened behind the service counter. A man in a DOT inspector's uniform emerged, carrying a clipboard, and looking exactly like the dozens of inspectors Frank had encountered over the years. He appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and the no-nonsense demeanor typical of enforcement personnel. "Mr. Delacroix?" the inspector said, consulting his clipboard. "I'm Inspector Williams. I need to discuss some violations we found during your inspection." Frank stood up, his mind racing. He hadn't given his name to anyone, and his truck registration wouldn't have been visible from the inspection lane. How could this inspector know who he was? "There must be some mistake," Frank said. "I've been driving for 15 years without a major violation. My cargo was properly secured." Inspector Williams smiled, but there was something cold about the expression. "Mr. Delacroix, our records show that you've been operating with fraudulent logbooks, exceeding federal hour limitations, and consistently failing to conduct proper pre-trip inspections." Frank felt his temper rising. "That's completely false. I maintain accurate logs, I never exceed my driving hours, and I inspect my equipment religiously. I want to see these records you're talking about." Inspector Williams turned his clipboard around, showing Frank a detailed violation report. But the information on the form made no sense. It showed violations going back over 20 years, including citations for trucks Frank had never owned and routes he'd never driven. Most disturbing of all, the report showed his date of death as November 3rd, 2020, today's date. "There's been some kind of computer error," Frank said, his voice barely steady. "These records are completely wrong." "Our computers don't make errors, Mr. Delacroix. They show that you died in a single-vehicle accident approximately 6 hours ago, just west of Barstow. Fell asleep at the wheel and hit a bridge abutment." Frank backed away from the counter, his heart pounding. "That's impossible. I'm standing right here. I'm alive." Inspector Williams consulted his clipboard again. "According to our records, Frank Delacroix, age 47, died at approximately 10:15 p.m. on November 2, 2020. Cause of death was blunt force trauma sustained in a commercial vehicle accident. Are you claiming these records are inaccurate?" "Yes, I'm claiming they're inaccurate because I'm not dead," Frank shouted. "This is insane. I want to speak to your supervisor." "I am the supervisor, Mr. Delacroix, and I'm afraid you're going to have to come with me." Inspector Williams walked around the counter, and Frank could see that his uniform, which had looked normal from a distance, was actually wrong in subtle ways. The badge was the right shape, but the wrong color. The patches showed an agency that didn't exist, and the man's skin had a waxy, artificial appearance. Frank ran. He burst out of the office building and sprinted toward his truck, Inspector Williams shouting behind him. But when Frank reached his truck, he found that it had changed. The blue and white paint job had faded to gray. The chrome was tarnished and corroded, and the tires looked old and cracked. Frank climbed into the cab, and his hands shook as he reached for the ignition. The interior of the truck was wrong too. The seats were torn and faded, the dashboard was cracked, and everything smelled of decay and abandonment. But the engine started, and Frank put the truck in gear and drove toward the way station exit as fast as he dared. In his mirrors, he could see Inspector Williams standing in the doorway of the office, watching him leave but making no effort to pursue. Frank didn't stop driving until he reached Phoenix 6 hours later. His delivery went smoothly, with no problems or questions about his cargo or his schedule. But when he tried to tell other drivers about his experience at the Barstow Way station, they looked at him like he was losing his mind. It wasn't until Frank returned home to Los Angeles 3 days later that he learned the truth about what had happened to him on Interstate 10. His wife Maria was waiting for him in their driveway, tears streaming down her face. Behind her stood 2 California Highway Patrol officers and a representative from his trucking company. "Frank?" Maria whispered. "Frank, is that really you?" "Of course it's me," Frank said, climbing down from his cab. "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" One of the CHP officers stepped forward. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. There are some questions we need to ask you." "Questions about what?" "About how you can be standing here when our records show that Frank Delacroix died in a truck accident 4 days ago, just west of Barstow." The investigation that followed was unlike anything in California law enforcement history. According to official records, Frank Delacroix had been killed when his truck left Interstate 10 and struck a bridge abutment at 10:17 p.m. on November 2, 2020. The coroner had identified his body, his family had been notified, and his trucking company had filed the appropriate insurance claims. But Frank was clearly alive, standing in his own driveway, with no injuries and clear memories of completing his delivery run to Phoenix. The accident scene investigation was reopened, and what authorities found was deeply disturbing. There had indeed been a fatal truck accident at the location and time indicated in the records. A commercial vehicle had left the highway and struck a concrete bridge support, killing the driver instantly. But the truck involved in the accident was not Frank's rig. It was an older vehicle that had been abandoned in a salvage yard for over 15 years, with registration records that had been altered to match Frank's truck. The body found at the scene was not Frank Delacroix, but an unidentified man whose fingerprints and dental records matched no one in any database. Most puzzling of all, surveillance footage from the accident scene showed that there had been no truck accident at all. The cameras recorded normal traffic flow throughout the night, with no incidents of any kind. Yet official records insisted that Frank Delacroix had died, that there had been an accident, and that a body had been recovered and identified. The Barstow Way station became the focus of the investigation when Frank described his encounter with Inspector Williams. But when authorities checked their records, no Inspector Williams had ever worked at the Barstow facility. The office Frank described visiting was locked and had been unused for over 2 years. Security cameras at the way station showed Frank's truck entering and leaving the facility, but the footage revealed that he had been alone throughout his visit. The cameras recorded him talking to empty air, following instructions that came from no visible source, opening his trailer doors for an inspection conducted by no one. Most disturbing of all, the timestamp on the security footage showed that Frank's visit had occurred on November 3, 2020, more than 12 hours after his official time of death. The case attracted national attention and prompted investigations by federal transportation authorities, but no explanation was ever found for what Frank had experienced. The official records showing his death were eventually corrected, but copies of the original documents remained in various databases, creating a bureaucratic nightmare that took months to resolve. Frank continued driving for another year, but the experience at Barstow had changed him fundamentally. He became obsessed with the idea that he had somehow died in that accident, and that everything since had been some kind of afterlife experience. He spent hours researching near-death experiences, consulting with psychologists, and trying to understand what had happened to him. Other truckers began reporting similar experiences at way stations across the country. Encounters with inspectors who didn't exist, facilities that operated during closed hours, and violations for accidents that had supposedly killed them but somehow hadn't happened. The phenomenon became known in trucking circles as ghost inspections, and drivers developed informal protocols for dealing with them. if approached by a way station during closed hours, if given orders that didn't make sense, if confronted with violation records that showed impossible information, the standard advice was to drive away immediately and report the incident to real authorities. But Frank couldn't drive away from his experience. The memory of Inspector Williams, of seeing his own death certificate, of operating a truck that had supposedly been destroyed in a fatal accident, haunted him day and night. He began to suspect that the boundary between life and death was thinner than most people realized, especially on the lonely highways where truckers spent so much of their lives. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist who specialized in trauma related to transportation accidents, interviewed Frank extensively as part of a research project on highway-related supernatural experiences. Her conclusion was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Frank experienced what appears to be a temporary displacement between two parallel realities, Dr. Chen wrote in her report. In one reality, he died in a truck accident on November 2, 2020. In another reality, he continued living and completed his delivery run. For a brief period at the Barstow way station, these two realities intersected, allowing him to experience both simultaneously. The theory suggested that major highways, especially those that had seen countless accidents over the years, might exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Traumatic events like fatal crashes could create reality tiers, where different versions of events coexisted, allowing people to glimpse what might have been or what had been prevented. Frank found Dr. Chen's theory both comforting and terrifying. It suggested that his experience had been real, not a hallucination or mental breakdown. But it also implied that there were versions of reality where he had died, where his family was mourning his loss, where his truck was a twisted wreck on a desert highway. The investigation into Frank's case was eventually closed without resolution, filed away as one of those inexplicable incidents that occasionally surface in law enforcement records. But the Department of Transportation quietly installed additional security measures at way stations throughout California, including enhanced surveillance systems and protocols for responding to reports of unusual activity. Frank's trucking company, initially skeptical of his story, began requiring all drivers to carry GPS tracking devices that recorded their locations continuously. The policy was officially described as a safety measure, but drivers understood that it was really designed to prevent situations where someone could be declared dead while apparently still alive and working. Frank retired from long-haul trucking 8 months after the Barstow incident, taking a local delivery job that kept him within 50 miles of home. He never passed another way station without feeling a chill of recognition, never heard his CB radio crackle, without wondering if the voice on the other end belonged to someone who was supposed to be dead. His wife Maria, who had experienced the trauma of being told her husband was dead, only to find him alive in their driveway, developed severe anxiety about his work. She would call him hourly during his runs, needing to hear his voice to confirm that he was still alive, still part of the reality where they had built their life together. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I'm not sure which version is real, Frank told a support group for families of accident survivors. Am I the Frank who died in that crash, dreaming about being alive? Or am I the Frank who lived, haunted by nightmares about dying? How can you be sure which reality you're actually living in? The question haunted others who heard Frank's story. Truckers began paying closer attention to their own experiences, noting moments when things seemed slightly wrong, when familiar routes looked different, when time seemed to skip or repeat. Some reported encounters with versions of themselves, brief glimpses of trucks identical to their own, driven by people who looked exactly like them. The phenomena seemed concentrated around locations where fatal accidents had occurred, as if violent deaths left permanent scars on the fabric of reality itself. Highway departments across the country began receiving reports of temporal anomalies at accident sites, though these reports were typically filed under driver fatigue or hallucinations due to stress. But Frank knew better. He knew that something fundamental had changed about his relationship with reality on that night at Barstow. He'd crossed a boundary that most people never even realize exists, experienced a moment where the curtain between different versions of existence had been pulled aside. 3 years later, Frank received a letter that brought his experience full circle. It was from the widow of a trucker named Dave Morrison, who had died in an accident near Barstow in November 2023. According to her letter, Dave had called her from his truck just before the accident, claiming that he was being pulled over at a way station that should have been closed. He said there was an inspector there who knew things about him that no one should have known, the widow wrote. Things about accidents that hadn't happened, violations he'd never committed. Dave said the inspector told him he was already dead, that he died in a crash hours earlier. Dave Morrison's truck had been found wrapped around the same bridge abutment where Frank's accident had supposedly occurred 3 years earlier. The official cause of death was falling asleep at the wheel, but the timeline didn't match. Dave had made several phone calls after his supposed time of death, had been tracked by GPS for hours after the accident had allegedly occurred. Frank realized that the Barstow Way Station was more than just a site of supernatural activity. It was a collection point, a place where the boundary between life and death had been permanently damaged by repeated traumas. Truckers who died in accidents along that stretch of highway were somehow drawn there, processed through a bureaucratic afterlife that mirrored the way stations they'd known in life. Inspector Williams, Frank understood now, was not a government employee but something else entirely, a keeper of records in a system that existed between realities, tracking the movement of souls along highways that stretched through dimensions most people never imagined. Frank began reaching out to other drivers who had reported similar experiences, building a network of people who had glimpsed the hidden infrastructure that underlies America's transportation system. They shared stories, compared experiences, and developed theories about the true nature of the roads they'd spent their lives traveling. What emerged was a picture of highways as more than just physical pathways between cities. They were conduits between different states of existence, channels through which the living and the dead continued to travel long after their official journeys had ended. Every mile of highway in this country has been paid for in blood, Frank would tell new members of the group. Every stretch of road has seen fatal accidents, and those deaths leave marks that never really fade. We just don't usually see them because we're focused on getting from point A to point B. But sometimes, if conditions are just right, you can glimpse the other traffic that shares the road with us. The group Frank founded, calling itself the Highway Threshold Society, began documenting supernatural experiences reported by commercial drivers across the country. Their database eventually contained over 300 reports of encounters with deceased truckers, phantom way stations, and bureaucratic processes that operated according to rules no living person understood. Government transportation authorities initially dismissed these reports as the fantasies of overtired drivers, but the consistency of the accounts eventually forced them to take notice. A classified federal study, conducted by the Department of Transportation in cooperation with several unnamed agencies, concluded that anomalous phenomena were indeed occurring at specific locations along America's highway system. The study's recommendations, which remain classified, reportedly included protocols for dealing with temporal displacement incidents and guidelines for identifying reality integration failures at accident sites. Several way stations across the country were quietly decommissioned and converted to other uses, though their selection criteria were never publicly explained. Frank's case became a template for understanding these phenomena, a baseline against which other experiences could be measured and categorized. His ability to return from his encounter at Barstow to continue living in the reality where he had survived made him unique among reported cases. Most people who experienced similar incidents were never seen again, disappearing into the bureaucratic maze of an afterlife that processed souls with the same impersonal efficiency as any government agency. Frank had somehow slipped through the cracks, returning to a life he was supposed to have lost. But the experience left him forever changed, forever aware that the boundary between existence and non-existence was far thinner than most people realized. Every time he drove past the spot where his accident had supposedly occurred, Frank felt a chill of recognition, a sense that he was looking into a window that showed a different version of his life. "I died on November 2nd, 2020, Frank would conclude when telling his story. But I also didn't die. Both things are true simultaneously. That's what I learned at the Barstow way station. Reality isn't as solid as we think it is. There are cracks in it, places where different versions of events exist side by side. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky or very lucky, you can slip from one version to another." The Barstow way station was eventually closed permanently, its functions transferred to a new facility 30 miles away. The official reason was budget constraints, but drivers in the know understood that it was really because too many impossible things had happened there. Too many people had encountered inspectors who didn't exist and received violations for crimes they hadn't committed. But closing the facility didn't end the phenomena. Reports of phantom inspections continued at way stations across the country. Encounters with bureaucratic officials who processed paperwork for accidents that existed in parallel realities. The highway system, it seemed, had developed its own supernatural infrastructure, complete with enforcement mechanisms that operated according to rules no living person fully understood. Frank continued to drive local routes for several more years, but he never again took a run that would require him to pass through the area where his accident had supposedly occurred. He'd seen enough of the machinery that operates behind the curtain of everyday reality, experienced enough of the bureaucratic processes that govern the movement between life and death. Some doors, once you've opened them, can never be completely closed, Frank would tell younger drivers who were curious about his experiences. "I know things now that I wish I didn't know, understand systems that I wish remained mysterious. The highway is more than just a road. It's a pathway between worlds, and sometimes the traffic going in both directions gets mixed up." Today, experienced truckers share Frank's story as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that lurk along America's highways. Not the obvious dangers of weather, mechanical failure, or other drivers, but the subtle threats that exist in the spaces between realities, the bureaucratic nightmares that can trap unwary souls in processing systems designed to handle the recently deceased. And sometimes, late at night when the highway stretches empty and endless ahead of them, drivers wonder if they're traveling through the world of the living or the world of the dead. If the way stations they pass are operated by government employees or by entities that serve a different kind of authority entirely. Because Frank Delacroix learned that the most dangerous inspections aren't the ones that check your cargo or your logbook. They're the ones that check whether you're supposed to still exist at all, conducted by inspectors who have access to records that show not just what you've done, but what you were supposed to do before your story ended on a desert highway at 10:17 p.m. on a November night, when the boundary between life and death proved to be nothing more than a bureaucratic formality that could be processed, filed, and sometimes even reversed by the right inspector at the right facility on the right night, when reality forgot to keep its paperwork in order.